How's it going, everybody? Gaurav Bhatt here. You're listening to the Express Sports Podcast, and it's game time. It's a very special edition of Game Time featuring an all-important conversation about racism in sport, specifically cricket. Our cricket expert Sriram Veera anchored this discussion about not just the current racism row in England cricket, but also how insidiously and systematically it puts off young kids and players looking to get into the sport. Sriram spoke with notable English journalist George Dobell. George was a key figure in enabling Azeem Rafiq to speak out against the menace, the difficulties he faced in the Yorkshire setup. So, without further delay, here's Sriram Veera's conversation with George Dobell.
Hello and a warm welcome to this special edition of Express Podcast. Before I introduce our guest George Dobell and the remarkable work he's been doing, let me just outline the discussion. It's about racism and how it spreads its tentacles all through the system, right up to clogging the pathways of young kids playing the game at grassroots. It affects how a system engages with the local communities, how it actively discourages them to move up the ladder professionally, how it inhibits the ambitions and desires of parents in making the kids get involved, and when they dare and make it, how it plays out within the actual cricket team. As you all must be aware, English cricket finds itself with a watershed moment right now, after the former Yorkshire cricketer Azeem Rafiq stood up and detailed the racism he faced. He named several big names. This led to several resignations on the Yorkshire's county board and continues to shake English cricket. Our guest George Dobell, formerly with Cricinfo, my colleague actually. Yeah, he did much better than me, of course. And now with the magazine and the site, The Cricketer, the world's oldest magazine, in fact, has got a digital presence. Please check that out. He enabled Rafiq to voice out his concerns. It's also thrown up several other interesting dynamics. The morality of the whistleblower itself. Do we have to get bogged down by that? And how it affects a journalist, in this case George, who develops such close emotional relationship with him. Does he feel betrayed? But that's for later. And also let me clarify, this is not George or me sitting in judgment here. In India, we are gripped with problems of caste and class, and we all know how it perniciously affects our lives outside cricket. But here we're looking at English cricket and racism, how it's playing out. George's work has been a passionate plea in some sense to coax all of us to look within and change and look around and speak up. And also look at our own unconscious biases that we all have. George, welcome to the show. Could you just at the start, we saw the first story with you and Azeem on September 2020. How did you get involved and what are your thoughts at the outset?
Okay, firstly, thank you for having me. It was a very good intro. A couple of other people had spoken to Azeem first. Wisdom, the magazine, had an interview talking about his new business. And their journalist Tahar had done a really good interview, which was talking about how Azeem's new business was trying to feed and, try to help NHS workers during COVID, really. And during that, Azeem became quite upset and mentioned some experiences of racism. That was followed up by James Butler in the Cricket Badger podcast, who did a really good interview where he talked about that in more detail. But the Cricket Badger podcast doesn't have a huge audience. It should. It's terrific. But it doesn't. So he asked me if I would do it. The relationship with James is interesting because he kind of owes me because I once saved him from drowning in Barbados. And I can tell you that a couple of weeks ago, when things were kicking off, he sent me a message to ask how I was doing and stuff. And I sent him a message back to say I should have let him drown. But generally, I've been very pleased I didn't. So he asked me to take it on because Cricinfo has such a large platform. And I actually resisted for a week. I was quite busy and I had done quite a few similar pieces. I mean, in retrospect, they seem quite minor by comparison. But there had been a lot of talk about race following the George Floyd murder, mainly regarding cricketers of African Caribbean heritage. And I'd found it quite draining and quite time-consuming. And I was a little bit reluctant to do it again. And also, that it was the middle of England were playing Pakistan at the time. And, that takes up a lot of time. By the way, I just threw on any old shirt I could find this morning. And so it took me a week or so to get round to phoning him, which I'm a bit embarrassed to admit. But then I did, and almost immediately I was struck by the level in which he sounded like a man at the end of his tether. He sounded broken and desperate. And very quickly, quite a few of his experience were corroborated. And at that stage, it became, I don't know, it felt like a responsibility to both help him and see how far this stretched and how far it went. And a lot of other people over time have come forward and said they've experienced similar things, but they're very, very reluctant to be as vocal as he has been. And he has just been relentless. He's always been prepared to talk. He hasn't let it go. And he's been nearly all the time a huge pleasure to work with.
Okay. He's been against Yorkshire for a while now. And then once you guys went, they had this huge report being tabled, which we never saw the day of the light. At least it was not shared with Azeem. And then the British UK Parliament had to get into act for it to tumble out.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the key thing. That Yorkshire were aware of those first two interviews. They were aware of the Wisden interview and they were aware of the Cricket Badger podcast. And they were asked for comment by both those organisations and ignored it. They just completely blanked it. And they thought they could do that because they didn't have a huge voice. But that's the difference with Cricinfo. Cricinfo does have a voice. And so we forced them, I guess. We shamed them into reacting. And of course, I also went the direction of the ECB, who, to be fair to them, were concerned immediately. I know that it seems that they haven't done a lot. And well, they didn't. They were slow to act. But the night of that very first piece, Tom Harrison, the ECB chief executive, got in touch immediately to ask for Azeem's phone number, as I remember, and phoned him straight away to sort of make his own inquiries and assure him that this was going to be taken seriously. And he has done. So they sort of forced Yorkshire to do something. But then this report was set up. And initially, you know, I don't know what month we were on by then, maybe September, maybe October. We're thinking of a report being out by Christmas. That's what they were talking about. Initially, I reckon they may even have said the end of the season. So we're sort of talking October or whatever it was. And then the word independent is one of the most overused words in cricket. It's up there with potential and promising for things that we use for years. Yeah. And they set up this supposedly independent review, which involved hand-picked people, a non-exec director of Yorkshire, or the Yorkshire board, who was involved in it, and the chair of Yorkshire's old law firm to have this review. And then the review took months and months and months. I mean, it took a year, I think. And during that process, witnesses kept coming forward to me and saying, well, look, I persuaded them to talk, persuaded them to come forward, and no one's bothered to get in touch. It happened again and again and again. So I became pretty confident pretty early that the report was a nonsense. Then it was finally completed and they wouldn't show it to anyone. Initially, they only showed it to three people, which was the Yorkshire chair, the Yorkshire chief executive, and the Yorkshire director of cricket. And as two of them were implicated negatively in the report, they didn't want it to go any further. So I started to get leaked bits of the report, and it was very, very damning. And the bit that I decided to go with first, which was only a 400-word article, it's amazing, better than me, those short news pieces, they almost take as long to write as they take to read, if you've got the facts. And it took moments to write. I went with a bit of the report which had actually found players not guilty of racism, where there were other bits I could have gone with where players were found guilty. But I found the not guilty verdict after using the P word and dismissing it as banter so absurd, particularly in conjunction with this. There was a paragraph that said that Azeem should face disciplinary action were he still a player at the club because he had used the word Zimo, short for Zimbabwean, of which there is no connotation, pejorative connotation whatsoever. And I presume that people in India understand the connotations of the P word in the UK in particular. It is not acceptable. Anyone who thinks it is acceptable is either a racist or an absolute idiot. To suggest that it is anyway an abbreviation like Aussie for Australian is so willfully stupid. It is actually a racist act. And people can read up on the connotations and stuff. It's pretty obvious. That is not a controversial statement that I've just made there. So for the report to say that the P word was used as banter and then say that the word Zimbo was used as a racially derogatory expression, I thought was kind of powerful because it showed that the whole report was a nonsense. And it is. It's a poor piece of work. And I actually understand why they can't publish it, because it is both incredibly critical of individuals, but also not particularly fair on some of them. So it was just a poor piece of work. And at that stage, the ECB needed to get involved, but Yorkshire wouldn't even share it with the ECB. I had it long before the ECB had it. And that's actually, I decided it was my idea to try and get politicians involved. And there was a little bit of reluctance initially, but that piece, the P word is banter piece, that cut through in a way that I probably never will write again did. And all of a sudden, the politicians were phoning me, and and asking for more details and stuff. And there was a sense of outrage, which was exactly the right reaction. And at that stage, people with a lot more power than cricket administrators or cricket journalists got involved, and it really feels like changes in the air. Honestly, think it feels like a crossroads moment for English cricket, and I hope, pretty confident actually, that we're going to look back on this as a really positive moment in English cricket.
True, hope so. For some of you who do not know how much it affected Rafiq, George has written about it. It pushed him close to committing suicide. Rafiq has talked about how he stood on his balcony and think about the worst things that he can do. He regularly come home from training and cry all day. It was very, very difficult times for him. George, you said you took a week to call to him, speak to him initially. And then once you meet up, you hear stuff like this. You and me are essentially cricket reporters. So how did you emotionally cope up with this? And why would you meet him at his home, I assume? How did that initial few weeks go?
No, this has been a phone relationship, really, because we're in the time of COVID. So I was in the outer bubble with the England team at the time that we first started talking, because I was allowed to go to games in the summer of 2020. So there was no talking to anyone else. You know, there was no meeting anybody else. I still haven't met him that many times. We talked a lot. It wasn't every day. Sometimes it would be 10 times a day. And it's certainly been most days. Certainly been most days this year. And for a very long time, it seemed he had almost no chance of success, if I'm honest. There were a couple of key moments. I think I can share what those were at this stage. There was some leaked information which related to a complaint that had been made in 2017, which I think was initially denied by the club. Not everyone at the club was bad, you see. And it admitted that both Adil Rashid and Azeem Rafiq had made complaints about racism, I think in September 2017. And Yorkshire snapped into action and held a meeting, I think it was in August 2018. Shows you how seriously they took that straight away. But that meeting was minuted and had been denied for quite a long time. So once we had the minutes, which I reckon that was February of this year. I remember where I was, and I remember saying to him, "You've just won this. You're going to win. All the rest of it is a bit of a detail. It might not seem like it for a few months, but I don't see any way out of it for them from here." And he was running it in conjunction with an employment tribunal, which, you know, I wasn't sure that was the way to go, to be honest. I mean, it certainly allowed people to say he's just doing it for money. But the thing was that he was using no-win, no-fee lawyers, and they've got to be paid. They've got to be paid, and that's the way they wanted to go. And actually it worked. They were probably right in the end. So there were lots of times, I'll give you some examples, that Yorkshire wanted to silence him one way or another. And one of those was the suggestion that some of his medical notes had to be made available to sort of give an insight into him. And there were some details in there that were intensely embarrassing. And instead of fighting, I don't think they could have insisted, by the way, that they were produced. Instead of fighting about it, instead of any delay, Azeem said, "Sod it, put them in my evidence. Just put them in there, put them out in the public domain, whatever." And I realised at that stage that they were in big trouble. Because he was then having to explain things, well, to me, to his legal team, he has a female lawyer and a female barrister, to his wife, to everyone he knows, really, that this stuff was going to come out in the public domain, and that, no one wants our medical notes published, for Lord's sake, do we? I certainly don't. And there were loads of moments like that. Then he was offered £105,000 at one stage if he signed a non-disclosure agreement. He barely mentioned it. It wasn't even in his thinking. I think one of the key things you have to remember in this is that, and I don't know if you watched his testimony in Parliament, so it's painful to watch, yeah, but there were two moments he broke down, and they're both broadly about grief. The first one was when he talked about the death of his son. Horrendous, yeah? And the second one was when he talked about his career. Now, I'm not saying it's the same. I'm not saying it's the same level of grief. Of course it isn't. But that is a man grieving the fact that he was a terrific cricketer and he's lost his childhood dream of being that cricketer. And he really was very good. He was captain of the England under-19 side, which contained, Joe Root, Jos Buttler, Ben Stokes. He was the standout player. Captain of Yorkshire at 21, all these sorts of things. He had a lot going for him, and it all fell apart. And I think you all know this, every sports person whose career finishes goes through a bit of a process of grief. And I think it's probably even worse if it's snatched away in such egregious fashion. And that is the two things he's been going through. Now, they combined in a way to give him a determination, at times even a sort of nihilistic determination. This was his mission and he wasn't going to give up. So there was nothing they could do. He had lost everything. He's lost his child. He's lost his career. He didn't care whether he lived or died. What was he going to do with money? He didn't care about that. So to see him go from that point, that low point where all he was motivated by is a desire to try and make it better for the next generation. I swear to God, that was his desire. He just wanted his other two children to have a better chance to be judged on merit rather than the colour of their skin. To see him to go from the point where he was absolutely nihilistically determined to pursue that course to the state which he is now, which is that, hopefully he can be part of some sort of rebuilding of the system. Hopefully his knowledge can be used, his good and bad experiences, and there are plenty of both, can be used to sort of create a better system. I don't know, despite the revelations of the recent days, I am still full of admiration for him.
Yeah, some of the revelations, for those who have not followed it closely, there has been allegation of anti-Semitism, which is sort of...
Well, it's not an allegation. It's look, he was guilty. And it's troubling. I didn't know that was coming. First I saw that was someone sent it to me on Twitter. So it's, we had a frank conversation. I mean, he said everything right to me, which is that, I'm not making any excuses. I'm sorry. It's unacceptable. And not even just that he was being stupid, that basically he was anti-Semitic at the time. And I think, without generalizing too much, no, I'm going to generalize a lot. I think it's fair to say there is probably an anti-Semitism problem within that Muslim community. And that is something that we have to confront as much as we do sort of racism of white people to Muslim people or Asian people or black people or whatever. It's another area that we have to confront. And so that was one thing. And I found that troubling, to be honest with you. And there was some text messages described as creepy to a teenage girl. I mean, I thought that some of the way that was reported stretched it to the absolute limit of what it was. I mean, it was, she was not a minor, categorically wasn't. There is no claim that a crime was committed. But having said that, they weren't cool. They weren't cool messages. And I'm not defending him on them either. So these things come forward and, I feel really uncomfortable. But at the same time, and I spoke to my daughter about this a lot because she had quite, I valued her view. Her view was basically, it absolutely doesn't diminish his claims of racism at all. But what it also does is maybe shine a light on the misogynistic attitude that is often prevalent in changing rooms, particularly male changing rooms. And that's something else we've got to look at if we're really interested in inclusivity, which we should be. So in some ways, he is a flawed hero. I suspect they all are. Every hero you can think of is, if you scratch the surface a little bit. In some ways, it makes me even more impressed that he dared to come forward. There's been allegation after allegation put to him some of them absolutely absurd and very serious. And people, they're nonsense. There's some which are true, some which are exaggerated, and some which are just nonsense. And he's had to put up with all of them in the last few weeks. As I would say, some racist people, some people very determined to prevent any change happening, have sought to discredit him. And they haven't just tried to discredit him. I think it's also sent a message to other people who were going to come forward. Now, I had several other people who are going to do stories with me over the weekend decided not to, which is absolutely their prerogative. But they decided not to because they saw the flack that was going in the direction of Azeem. And so we silenced whistleblowers in that way. And that's probably what they wanted to do. So in that way, I sort of have even more respect for Azeem in a funny way, in a funny roundabout way, because he is so flawed and he did know that some of this stuff would come out in public. And he went ahead nevertheless. And this is how they silence people, They'll use whatever they've got. I mean, he's had death threats. I'm not saying those are orchestrated by an organisation. I'm really not. But he's had death threats. In fact, he's been having police protection in the last few days. I mean, Lord. He has had, the family have had threats. There have been payoff attempts. There have been attempts to discredit him. And the drip effect of all the criticism and abuse is very difficult. It might not sound like much, but when your phone's going 100 times a day and it's crisis after crisis, it's draining, particularly if it goes on for 18 months like this. So it's been very difficult for him and it's very difficult for whistleblowers. And I think this is why, despite his past, his most imperfect past, this is still why I think the game owes him a great deal.
Absolutely. The morality of the whistleblower, we should just focus how important it is. Of course, it's good if he's perfect, but that's not going to be the case with you, me, him, anybody. But how important it is to move past that and focus on the issues where the finger is pointing. It sort of, even his crimes, it actually widens the pool of that racism thing, right? There's more need to look for organization.
Absolutely right. To be fair, I think the ECB get this entirely. I mean, they might have to look into some of the things he's done. That's fine. So they should. But I don't think it's taking their eye off the fact that actually quite a lot of people have come forward. Now, they might not all want to do articles, but quite a lot of people are having private conversations where they feel for the first time it's worth coming forward. And one of the things I was struck by, the pieces I've done in recent days, with Junaid at Essex, with Maurice Chambers, various other people, they've all mentioned Azeem. They've all said, look, Junaid put it so well. Junaid Ahmed from Essex said, I didn't feel I had a voice. I didn't think there was any point complaining. And he literally said, I've been inspired by what Azeem's done. And so Junaid is a particularly eloquent guy who is doing particularly worthwhile work at grassroots levels in English cricket. He's working with people in a very poor part of London, a lot of them from the Bangladeshi community, and trying to give them opportunities to break into mainstream cricket. And he's doing a really good job of it. But there are all these barriers. And whether these barriers are all just racism. Look, I've got a new phrase which I'm using quite a lot, and I'm going to bore you with it again. And it is this idea that the Eskimos have 100 words for snow, supposedly, because they have so much of it. Well, I think we need 100 words for racism, because it seems to me there's a chasm between the sort of person who goes out and tries to beat up someone on a Saturday night because they're not the same colour or religion, and someone who might be generationally clumsy, might be ignorant even, might not know any better, and actually is just nervous and won't talk about the subject because they're desperate not to put a foot wrong. There's a lot of that going on. And you can see why, because, you can say anything you like on Twitter and someone will say you're racist. And actually, I keep saying, we've got to talk. We've got to have the conversations. This is why it's so important what's happened since George Floyd was murdered, really, actually. There's certainly been a conversation ongoing in, America and the UK. And we've got to keep on doing that. But equally, I'm not sure that just branding everyone racist as if they're, the cop who murdered George Floyd is helpful. And we're going to have to, at some stage, be a little bit forgiving with one another. We rehabilitate murderers and muggers. We're going to have to rehabilitate contrite racists too. And also, if we're honest, most of us white middle-class guys in the UK, we have at least been complicit because we've turned the other cheek at times, or we weren't aware. And I've certainly been involved in conversations where I should have stopped what was going on and said, this is unacceptable. I've resolved to do that from now on. But I look back and there's been several times when I've been party to stuff which I should have stopped. And one of the nice stories, and there are quite a lot of nice stories actually, is that nothing bad ever happened in front of Andy Flower at Essex, for example, because I'm told Andy Flower's reputation was such that no one would dare. All these players independently have said to me, Andy Flower, he was great. There's a nice example of Rob Key at Kent hearing something that was inappropriate. And it was from an overseas player, funnily enough, and coming down on it real hard immediately, making sure that the environment... So what happened at Yorkshire and to some extent Essex is you had a couple of people who were probably racist, old-fashioned card-carrying racists, and they start to create a culture. And unless that culture is crushed immediately, it has a chance of spreading. And things that shouldn't be acceptable become at least overlooked. And Rob Key at Kent, for example, ensured that can never happen. And that's what we all have to do. That's what absolutely everyone has to do. So, I don't know. I've given a really long, rambling answer to you there, eh?
No. And looking on the other side now on your thing, how much has it affected you? Were you emotional ready when you went in? And now I see you interact lots on Twitter. Sometimes I wonder the kind of conversations you get into with, I would never do it. But you're pushing yourself and you have explained as well, because I need to do it. I've been silent for too long. And you sort of engage with people to a point where then you say, okay, bye. But you're engaging. So how has this whole experience changed you as a person?
Okay, so for the Twitter thing, I only really do Twitter as a social media. It's the only one I do now, really. And I think it's a half-decent way of being accountable. So one of the things I learned as a young journalist, I was a journalist at the Birmingham Post, cricket correspondent there. One of the things that I was very lucky is that I walked around the ground at Edgbaston on New Road every day, and the readers would talk to me. And they kind of gave me a kick up the butt every day, because if they didn't think I was doing a good job, they would tell me. And to some extent, I use Twitter the same way. So one, it's to be accountable. And two, there's a lot of knowledge out there. A lot of people I respect think I got something wrong the other day. I listened. The key thing with engaging in some of these people is, one, I think I can win them over, if I'm honest. And two, I don't want to let them get away with anything if they're trying to be a smart ass with me. So if it gets to the stage where I don't think I can win them over, okay, move on, let them go. It's very easy just to mute somebody. I mean, it's not like once you've done it, it's not like you ever think of them again, is it? So that's always an option. The mute button is one of the great inventions. But generally, I think I'll win them over. You know, if you did a Venn diagram of idiots and racists, it's basically an eclipse. So, I mean, I've never met an intelligent racist. So I'm pretty confident that I can win people over. Just with logic. It's not a logical thing to be racist. So that's the basis of that. Listen, it's been fine. It's been, look, it's obviously felt like a responsibility at times. And there have been times I've been worried about Azeem, but there's times you're worried about any friend. It's been a joy for me. I feel guilty about saying it. I've benefited. I'm a beneficiary of racism. I mean, what? I am, though. And there's all sorts of, I have some sort of conflicted feelings here because it shouldn't really have taken a middle-class white guy to tell this story. But it has. So what are we going to do about it? I don't know, but I couldn't turn the other way, could I? But I think we should be aware that that's the case. It's taken a middle-class, middle-aged white fella working for an American company, generally, to tell that story. Shouldn't be that way, should it? So that's something that I am aware of. In terms of the other stuff, look, I have such a lovely job, as you know, blessed. And actually, it's been a thrill to be able to use it occasionally to do something that felt a bit worthwhile. And it has felt worthwhile. So it hasn't, I'm not the tortured artist. I'm really not. I'm doing my job. It's been a thrill to work with Azeem. Have there been times when it's been tiring and all-encompassing? Yeah. But pretty much anything that's worthwhile is pretty difficult, isn't it?
True. You've met these racists and other people who object to you, and on Twitter, that is. But on former cricketers like be it Gary Balance, Michael Vaughan, Hogarth, and Tim Bresnan, there are lots of people Azeem Rafiq is named in his testimony, a submission to the Employment Tribunal. I urge people to look it up. Some of them is shocking, where they've been called like elephant washers, go sit near the toilets. It's just not the P word. It's just not, you go brown guy or a black guy, whatever the case may be. It's got much more beyond that as well. But that apart, has any of the former cricketers approached you and said, George, what are you doing?
Yeah, they have, yeah. So I liked one or two of those guys. I decided very early on not to name. Azeem and I talked about this, and we decided that first piece, which, it ended up, Gary Balance came forward, admitted it was about him. So I actually quite liked Gary Balance as a guy. He is, in many ways, a fun guy, and I had never seen that side of him, so I was terribly disappointed when I learned all this. The reason that not to name him was not really, well, I was going to say it wasn't to protect him. Actually, it was partly. But the main motivation was to ensure that it didn't become about individuals. It was very, very obvious very early on that this was more than one or two people having unpleasant attitudes. It was more about a whole club that had gone rotten. I still believe that. The club had gone rotten. And it was their failure to crack down on it, the failure to do anything about the reporting, and then a cover-up. So I wanted to make it very clearly about the whole institution. And I think if we had named Gary Balance in that first piece, we wouldn't have got to a stage where an MP was calling for the whole Yorkshire board to resign 24 hours later. We wouldn't have done that. All the focus would have been on Gary Balance. So I know some people think I got that wrong. Look, you might be right, but that was the reasons. The other thing was I thought Gary was maybe somewhat fragile and needed help. Azeem certainly thought that. For all unpleasantness between them, Azeem doesn't want anyone to feel like he felt. So there's a level, I suppose, compassion there. In terms of, one of those people you just mentioned phoned. They phoned, by the way, after the very first article. They phoned Azeem, first of all, and they phoned Azeem and apologised. So this is not when we knew there was going to be a report. It's not when they knew their name was going to come out. They weren't trying to save their skin. They phoned and they were horrified because they recognised themselves in the piece, and they were humiliated and appalled that they had been so damaging. And he phoned and he was genuinely contrite, reflective. I then spoke to him, I've spoken to him a few times and urged him to do a piece where he said, because I think this would be so valuable, if one of these very big name players came forward and said, do you know what, I look back and I'm horrified at the way I was. I wasn't good enough. I've learned and I want to be better. I'm not saying they're going to win everyone over, but to some extent, that's where we are as a society. Honestly, I mean that. To a greater or lesser extent, that's where Britain is. So I think it would be really valuable for someone to actually say that and be the sort of symbol for that. We now have whistleblowers we can admire. But actually, let's have the reform racist. We admire reform gamblers, people who have recovered from alcohol addictions. Why can't we do that with racism? Genuinely, I'd be interested in feedback. Is that so ridiculous? They have to be contrite. They have to want to be better. But I think that would be quite a useful journey to report upon. So I've urged one or two people to have that conversation. And it would be hugely brave, wouldn't it? It would be very, very brave. So I understand why they haven't done that. But yes, there are all sorts of different views. Some people have said, look, I'm really sorry, I'm embarrassed. And some people have suggested that they might take legal action. I haven't had any legal letters, but I hear that's a possibility. Fine. Whatever comes will come, and we'll combat that in due course.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned, let's say somebody has been racist in the past. Once he shows remorse and wants to learn, can he apologize and then can he move on? Can the system absorb him back? What's the best way to go about it? Of course, how do you know his remorse? You just have to take his word, because usually people don't even admit it.
Well, I mean, for a start, it's not my place to say, can we take him back? I mean, my instinct is always yes, for what it's worth. But I am, again, a middle-class white fella. You know, I haven't suffered from racism. So it's not really my place to say, oh, come on.
And as you
them.
said, the degrees of racism, the different 100 definitions, that plays a part, I guess.
And just saying, sorry, I want to move on after you've been caught, I don't know that that's enough. So there would have to be some... I'm a bit surprised that Gary Balance, for example, or his management team haven't said, you know, Gary needs to go through a process. He's going to maybe donate something. He's maybe going to work with various communities. He's going to learn, and he's going to, you know, there's going to be some payback. And, you know, if I'd been his manager or his mum and dad or something, I think I might have done that. But, you know, mate, there's time. Yeah, you can't just say sorry when you're caught. You know, we've seen too much of that, haven't we? But yeah, so just saying sorry is not enough. But I say again, I think we'll rip the game apart if we are completely unforgiving in a sort of puritanical sense. So, but again, these questions are not for me. I'm just one person. And the whole truth and reconciliation idea, I have a lot of time for. You know, South Africa are going through it. I think I think their problems are deeper, aren't they? You know, that's unusual society in lots of ways. But if they can go through it, the ECB can go through it. And the changes that I'm seeing the ECB put into place, I know people have been cynical about them, but I don't know if you saw, but I got leaked this 12-point plan that they're trying to enact, which hopefully they're going to announce today. Look, I saw good stuff in there. I saw real tangible signs of improvement in there. And that's never happened before. What the tragedy would be is if we're still talking about this in 20 years and this is a missed opportunity. That would be horrendous. We have to seize this moment. This is a crossroads for the English game, and we have to make the right turn. I think we will.
I think that's a perfect way to end the show. It's tremendously interesting times for your country. Your Prime Minister loves Peppa Pig. That's good to know. And then you have all this sorts of sordid stuff going on. But as you say, if you're confident that things will change, things are changing, I think that's as good as a note to end this on. Thanks a lot, George, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Huge pleasure, and good to see you.
You were listening to Express Sports by the Indian Express. This week's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.